Sometimes the hardest part about inheriting your family's legacy isn't proving it belongs to you. It's convincing the people standing on it. The smell of fresh-cut hay drifted through the open window of my old Ford F-250 as the narrow county road curved toward the place I had called home every summer of my childhood. The morning sun stretched across hundreds of acres of rolling farmland, painting the weathered red barn with the same golden light I remembered from the days my father would hand me a pair of work gloves that were always 2 sizes too big and tell me that land never lied if you treated it with respect. It had been 3 weeks since we buried him. 3 weeks of paperwork, condolences, casseroles from neighbors, and sleepless nights that always ended with me staring at the ceiling, hearing his voice in my head reminding me that the Walker family never gave up what generations had built. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I reached the entrance to the farm, but something immediately felt wrong. The old wooden gate my grandfather had built by hand was gone. In its place stood a black steel security gate with polished stone pillars on each side and a sign that read, Silver Creek Estates Private Property. Authorized access only. For a second, I honestly wondered if I had taken the wrong road. But then I saw the giant oak tree where my dad had carved our family initials nearly 40 years earlier. This was our land. Every inch of it. Before I could pull another 10 feet forward, 2 men in matching gray security uniforms stepped into the driveway. One raised his hand while the other rested a tablet against his arm, like he had rehearsed this moment all morning. I rolled down my window, expecting someone to apologize for the confusion. Instead, the taller guard glanced at the screen, looked directly at me, and said in the calmest voice imaginable, "Ethan Walker?" I nodded. He barely hesitated before delivering the sentence that made the air feel strangely heavier. "You're on the banned access list. You are not permitted to enter this property." I actually laughed because I thought it had to be some ridiculous mistake. "This is my father's farm," I said. "I grew up here." Neither man reacted. The shorter guard simply pointed toward the road behind me. "Sir, we've been instructed that if you arrive, you're to leave immediately." I looked past them toward the farmhouse, sitting almost a quarter-mile away. I could still see the wraparound porch where my dad drank coffee every sunrise. I could almost hear the windmill squeaking above the cattle pasture and smell the diesel from the old tractor that somehow always started on the second try. Everything beyond that gate carried my family's fingerprints, yet complete strangers were standing there acting like I was the trespasser. Then another sound broke the silence. The soft hum of a luxury SUV rolled up behind me. A pearl-white vehicle stopped just inside the gate, and a woman stepped out wearing pressed cream-colored slacks, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of confident smile that only comes from believing the outcome has already been decided. She folded her arms, looked at me through the bars of the gate, and said, "Mr. Walker, I was beginning to wonder when you'd finally show up." The woman slowly removed her sunglasses, and I recognized her immediately. Linda Crawford. She had lived 3 roads over for years, back when Silver Creek was nothing more than scattered ranches and working farms instead of polished entrances and matching mailboxes. She used to wave at my father from her car. Now she looked at me like she was greeting a delivery driver who had stopped at the wrong address. The scent of expensive perfume drifted through the gate as she smiled with practiced confidence. "I understand this must be emotional," she said, "but your father made certain decisions before he passed away. This property is under community management now." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to understand whether I had missed some impossible chapter of my own family's story. My father was Robert Walker. He had been born in the farmhouse sitting beyond those fields. His father had built the first cattle barn in 1969 using reclaimed oak beams hauled from an abandoned mill nearly 30 miles away. Every fence post on that farm had a story. Every pond, every pasture, every weathered gate carried fingerprints from 3 generations of Walkers who believed land was not something you simply owned. It was something you protected until it became someone else's responsibility. My own path had taken me away from the farm years earlier. I became a civil engineer, designing bridges and rural infrastructure across Texas, because my father always said someone in the family needed to understand what the future looked like while someone else remembered the past. Even after I moved to Austin, I drove back almost every month. We repaired fences together. We checked irrigation lines. We sat on the porch drinking black coffee before sunrise without saying much because neither of us ever needed many words. The silence always carried enough. During his final months, cancer stole his strength, but never his stubbornness. I offered more than once to move him closer to the city where treatment would be easier. He refused every single time. If I have one more sunrise left, he told me, I want it to be right here. Those words replayed in my head as I looked through the steel bars separating me from the front porch where we shared our last cup of coffee less than a month earlier. Linda reached into a leather folder and held up several neatly printed documents without offering them to me. Everything has been reviewed, she continued. The community has invested significant resources into protecting this property. Protecting it. The word almost made me smile. My father never needed strangers to protect land that had survived droughts, floods, recessions, and 70 years of hard work. The breeze carried the familiar smell of cedar and fresh soil across the fields, and somewhere beyond the barn I heard the faint creak of the old windmill turning exactly the way it always had. That sound settled something inside me. Farms remember. They remember every season, every footprint, every promise made beneath open skies. And I knew my father well enough to believe one thing with absolute certainty. If Robert Walker had left this world, he had not left his family defenseless. I simply had not found what he wanted me to see yet. Linda never raised her voice. She did not have to. People who spend years believing they are always right learn to speak like every sentence has already been approved. She opened the leather folder and slowly turned the first page toward the security guards instead of toward me. According to the Silver Creek Estates Transition Agreement, she said, the Walker property has been incorporated into the Community Conservation District. Entry is restricted until ownership matters are fully resolved. Ownership matters. Those two words echoed in my head louder than the windmill turning across the pasture. I looked at the guards. Neither one looked angry or hostile. They simply believed the paperwork in front of them more than the man standing outside the gate. That realization bothered me more than anything else. Paper could change people's minds faster than truth. I reached into my truck and pulled out the old brass key ring my father had carried for nearly 30 years. The largest key was worn smooth from thousands of mornings opening this very gate before sunrise. I held it up against the new electronic keypad mounted beside the steel entrance. You replaced a lock that has been here longer than most of the houses inside your subdivision, I said quietly. Linda barely smiled. Progress requires change, Mr. Walker. I glanced beyond the gate again. Fresh white fencing stretched across sections of pasture where weathered cedar posts had stood my entire life. Decorative stone signs marked private walking trails that had once been cattle paths. Even the equipment shed had been painted a bright gray that looked completely out of place against the old red barn. Someone had not simply occupied our farm. They had begun rewriting its identity. The smell of fresh paint mixed with cut grass drifted across the property, covering the familiar scent of old timber and machine oil that had always greeted me whenever I came home. It felt like listening to someone else tell my family's story with all the important pages missing. Linda stepped closer to the gate. Your father understood that this community represented the future. He wanted cooperation instead of conflict. I almost answered immediately, but something stopped me. My father had taught me one lesson over and over while repairing broken fences. The first explanation is rarely the true one. Listen before you speak. Watch before you move. So I watched. Behind Linda, I noticed workers unloading landscaping materials near the farmhouse porch. A delivery truck backed toward the equipment barn carrying decorative shrubs instead of fencing supplies. Two golf carts rolled down the gravel lane where tractors used to leave tire tracks after long summer days. They were acting like owners. They were investing money. They were making permanent changes because they believed no one would ever challenge them. That confidence told me more than Linda's words ever could. She thought this fight had already been won before I arrived. She extended another sheet of paper toward the guards, and one of them handed me a neatly printed notice through the bars. At the top, in bold black letters, it read, "Official Trespass Warning." My own last name appeared beneath it. The paper felt crisp between my fingers, still warm from the morning printer. I folded it carefully instead of arguing. My father used to say that the most dangerous mistake an overconfident person can make is assuming silence means surrender. I slipped the notice into my jacket pocket, looked one last time toward the farmhouse, and as I turned back toward my truck, something caught my eye near the old machine shed. Half hidden beneath years of climbing ivy, the rusted metal mailbox my father never used was still standing exactly where he had left it. I drove away from the gate slowly, letting the tires roll across the loose gravel instead of throwing dust behind me. My father always said that rushing clouds your judgment, and right then I needed a clear head more than I needed the satisfaction of arguing with people who had already decided their version of the truth. The afternoon sun reflected off the new steel gate in my rearview mirror until it disappeared behind a curve in the road, but the image refused to leave my mind. The Walker farm had never needed guards. It had never needed access badges or electronic keypads. For more than 50 years, the only thing that welcomed visitors was an old wooden sign my grandfather carved himself and a gravel driveway that led to a front porch where coffee was always hot and the door was rarely locked. Before heading back toward town, I pulled onto the shoulder across from the eastern pasture. From there I could still see part of the property through a break in the cedar trees. The fields looked different. Fresh survey flags dotted the grass every 20 or 30 feet. Bright orange stakes outlined rectangles that had never existed before. Utility trucks moved slowly across the back pasture, while workers measured distances and marked lines with fluorescent paint. They were not maintaining farmland. They were preparing it for something else. The realization settled in my stomach like a cold stone. Linda had not simply claimed authority over my father's property. She was changing it piece by piece before anyone could stop her. As I watched, another pickup truck arrived pulling a trailer loaded with decorative fencing that belonged around upscale subdivisions, not working cattle land. I remembered spending entire weekends with my father replacing old cedar rails after spring storms. Every board we installed had purpose. These new materials looked expensive, polished, and completely out of place. My phone buzzed with a message from an old family friend named Hank Morrison, whose ranch bordered ours to the north. The text was short. Saw you at the gate. Meet me at Miller's Diner. 30 minutes later, the smell of bacon, fresh coffee, and warm biscuits filled the small restaurant where half the county still gathered every morning. Hank slid into the booth across from me, removed his weathered cap, and sighed before saying a single word. He had known my father since high school. The lines on his face came from decades under the Texas sun, and he was not the kind of man who wasted words. Your dad fought them for months, he finally said. I looked up immediately. What do you mean? Hank stirred his coffee without drinking it. That woman kept showing up with lawyers, consultants, survey crews, and board members. She kept talking about partnerships, conservation, districts, community access, and future development. Your father sent every one of them back down the driveway. I felt my heart beat slow as another piece of the puzzle settled into place. Linda had stood at that gate earlier and claimed my father wanted cooperation. Hank's eyes told a completely different story. He reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and laid a small brass mailbox key on the table between us. The metal was scratched, old, and immediately familiar. A week before he passed, Hank said quietly, "Your father told me that if anything ever felt wrong, you should check the old mailbox by the machine shed before you believed anybody carrying fancy paperwork." The brass key felt heavier than it should have as I turned it over in my palm under the fading afternoon light. My father had always believed that important things did not need to be hidden in elaborate safes or locked behind expensive security systems. They simply needed to be placed where only the right person would think to look. After leaving the diner, I drove the back county roads until I reached the fence line bordering the northern edge of our property. From there, the old mailbox stood almost hidden beneath thick ivy exactly where I had seen it earlier through the gate. The problem was that reaching it meant crossing a narrow strip of land that now sat behind the new security fencing. I parked along the public shoulder and waited. Pickup trucks came and went inside the property as landscaping crews finished for the day. Eventually, the activity slowed, and the only sounds left were crickets beginning their evening chorus and the distant creak of the familiar windmill turning against the Texas sky. I walked carefully along the county easement until I stood beside the rusted mailbox. Years of weather had faded its red paint into dull brown, and vines wrapped around the wooden post as though nature itself had been protecting it. I slipped the brass key into the old lock. It turned smoothly on the first try. Inside there were no stacks of papers or thick folders like I had imagined. There was only a weathered manila envelope sealed with clear tape and my name written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting. Seeing those letters stopped me cold. He had written them slowly, the way he had during his final months when every movement required more effort than he would ever admit. I carefully opened the envelope and found a handwritten note folded around a small flash drive and a faded receipt from the county clerk's office dated nearly 8 months earlier. The note was short. If you are reading this, someone is trying to convince you that paper is stronger than truth. Start with the receipt. Then ask why they never wanted anyone looking before the improvements began. I read the message 3 times before slipping everything safely into my jacket. My engineering background had taught me to pay attention to sequence. The receipt came months before any construction crews appeared on the property, before any new fencing, before any electronic gates. That timeline did not fit the story Linda had told me. Instead of driving home, I headed straight to the county records office, hoping to review public filings before it closed. Unfortunately, I arrived just as an employee was locking the front entrance for the evening. She apologized politely and explained that archived property records could only be accessed the following morning. As I turned back toward my truck, I noticed another vehicle parked across the street. It was the same pearl white sport utility vehicle Linda had driven earlier. She remained inside, speaking on her phone while looking directly toward the courthouse entrance. She smiled when our eyes met through the windshield, then calmly pulled away without a wave. That smile told me she expected tomorrow to end exactly the way today had. But sitting inside my jacket was an envelope my father had prepared months before any of this unfolded, and for the first time since being stopped at the gate, I no longer felt like I was chasing answers. I felt like I had just found the first piece of a trail my father had deliberately left behind. The county records office opened at 8 o'clock sharp, and I was already waiting outside with a paper cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. The air carried the clean smell of fresh rain from a storm that had passed before sunrise, and the courthouse lawn still glistened beneath the early Texas light. Inside, nothing had changed in decades. Wooden counters, faded tile floors, and shelves lined with thick property books reminded me that long before computers stored ownership records, communities trusted ink, signatures, and patience. I handed the clerk the faded receipt my father had left inside the envelope. She adjusted her glasses, studied the document for a moment, and then looked up with a puzzled expression. "This references an archived survey amendment," she said. "Those files are stored separately. Give me a few minutes." I watched as she disappeared through a heavy records door while the quiet hum of fluorescent lights filled the room. Every passing minute seemed longer than the last. Finally, she returned carrying a narrow archive box covered with years of dust. She carefully removed several folded documents, placing each one across the counter. The first was an updated boundary survey completed 8 months earlier. The second was a recorded easement agreement signed years before Silver Creek Estates had even been planned. The third document made my pulse quicken. It was a notarized declaration filed personally by my father, stating that no homeowners association, residential development, or future community board could claim management authority over the Walker farm without a separately recorded deed signed by every lawful beneficiary of the family trust. I read the paragraph twice to make certain I understood it correctly. My name appeared as one of those beneficiaries. I had never signed anything. The clerk quietly pointed toward another page attached behind the declaration. There is also a notice requesting that any future filings affecting this parcel receive additional verification because of its trust status. She paused before adding, "I do not see any record showing that requirement was completed. My engineering career had taught me that systems only fail when someone ignores a required step." Suddenly, the timeline my father left behind made perfect sense. He had anticipated that someone might eventually attempt to bypass the legal protections surrounding the farm. So months before his death, he quietly strengthened the public record. He had not hidden the truth. He had placed it exactly where the law expected it to be found. I requested certified copies of every document, and while the clerk prepared them, I studied the survey maps spread across the counter. The bright orange stakes I had seen from the roadside matched newly proposed lot lines sketched in pencil over sections of pasture that the official survey clearly identified as protected agricultural acreage. Those markings were not part of the recorded documents. Someone had added them later. I carefully rolled the certified copies into a protective tube, and thanked the clerk before walking back toward the courthouse entrance. Outside, the morning breeze carried the distant scent of wet cedar. Across the street, parked in exactly the same place as the evening before, sat the familiar pearl-white sport utility vehicle. This time Linda was standing beside it, speaking confidently with a man wearing an expensive suit, while both of them smiled toward the courthouse doors. Neither of them realized that the papers they believed would secure the future of the property had just been quietly overshadowed by documents my father had prepared months before either of them ever thought they had won. Instead of driving straight back to the farm, I headed to the office of a title attorney my father had trusted for years, Margaret Ellis. Her building overlooked the old courthouse square, and stepping inside felt like stepping into another era where thick law books still lined polished wooden shelves, and every conversation happened face-to-face instead of through email. She listened without interrupting as I laid the certified copies across her conference table beside the survey map, the handwritten note from my father, and the flash drive I had not yet examined. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled in a way that immediately reminded me of my father whenever I solved a difficult problem as a kid. "Your father was preparing for this long before anyone else realized there would be a dispute," she said. "The documents are important, but timing is even more important." She explained that if the homeowners association had already begun altering protected agricultural land while relying on incomplete authority, every additional improvement could become another piece of evidence. I asked if we should confront Linda immediately. Margaret slowly shook her head. "No, do not interrupt people who believe they are making irreversible decisions. Let them continue documenting their own assumptions." That advice matched exactly what my father used to tell me whenever we repaired equipment together. If you stop someone too early, they blame confusion. If you allow them to finish, the facts speak for themselves. We spent the next several hours building a careful timeline from public records, survey filings, contractor permits, and dated photographs I still had on my phone from visits during my father's illness. Every image became another reference point. The old cedar fence before it disappeared. The original gravel lane before decorative stone borders appeared. The weathered machine shed before fresh gray paint covered its aging boards. None of those photographs had seemed important when I took them. Now they quietly recorded the history of a farm before someone tried to rewrite it. That evening I parked once again along the county road overlooking the eastern pasture. The setting sun stretched long shadows across the fields while workers continued unloading landscaping materials from another trailer. A crew installed elegant black lanterns along the driveway where my father had always preferred simple wooden posts. Nearby, fresh concrete forms outlined what looked like the beginning of a small visitor entrance. Every truck carried company logos. Every worker wore uniforms. Every delivery left behind invoices, schedules, and permits somewhere. As a civil engineer, I understood something many people overlooked. Construction always leaves a paper trail. You cannot move earth, install utilities, or alter access roads without creating records. I quietly photographed everything visible from the public roadway, making certain every picture included dates, locations, and surrounding landmarks. I never crossed the fence. I never argued with the guards. I simply observed. Across the pasture, I noticed Linda speaking confidently with several contractors while pointing toward the farmhouse porch. They laughed together as though planning the future of a property that already belonged to them. They had no reason to suspect that every truck arriving through that gate was adding another page to a timeline that would eventually tell a very different story. As darkness settled over the fields, I returned to my truck and finally plugged my father's flash drive into my laptop. A single folder appeared on the screen. Its name consisted of only 4 words, simple enough to make my heart race before I even opened it. Read this last. My finger hovered over the folder for several seconds before I finally opened it. Inside were scanned documents, dated photographs, short video clips, and one audio recording labeled simply, "For Ethan." I put on my headphones and pressed play. My father's voice filled the quiet cab of my truck, a little weaker than I remembered during his healthiest years, but steady enough to sound unmistakably like the man who had taught me everything that mattered. "If you are listening to this, son, it means someone finally tried to take the shortcut I expected they would." I closed my eyes as he continued. He explained that nearly a year earlier representatives connected to the neighborhood association had approached him with proposals that sounded harmless at first. They talked about beautification, shared maintenance, increased property values, and preserving open space. But every revised draft quietly expanded their authority a little further. My father said he never signed any document transferring ownership, management, or control because he knew that once land stopped belonging to the family caring for it, promises could change faster than seasons. The folder also contained photographs of every meeting he attended. Linda appeared in several of them, smiling beside display boards filled with colorful development sketches. In another image, my father stood alone beside the original survey markers that had separated our agricultural property from the subdivision for decades. Every file carried a timestamp. Every conversation matched dates already listed in the county records. Then I opened a document titled Construction Timeline. It listed contractor names, permit numbers, equipment deliveries, and projected completion dates extending months into the future. Someone had been planning improvements on land they did not legally control long before I arrived at the front gate. The final file surprised me most. It was a letter addressed to Margaret Ellis, instructing her not to begin legal action immediately if a dispute ever occurred. Instead, my father requested that every public improvement continue until complete records existed showing exactly who authorized each change. Suddenly, everything fit together. Margaret had not been delaying because she lacked confidence. She had been following my father's instructions. The evidence was becoming stronger with every truck that entered the property, every contractor invoice, every permit application, and every new structure added to the farm. Early the next morning, Margaret arranged a formal meeting with county officials responsible for land records, agricultural zoning, and survey compliance. Certified copies of every filing were placed side by side across a long conference table, while licensed survey maps were compared with the ongoing construction plans. Questions that had been ignored before now demanded answers. Which recorded deed granted management authority over the Walker farm? Where was the signed approval from every trust beneficiary required by the public declaration? Why had protected agricultural boundaries been treated as though they belonged inside a residential development plan? No one in the room could produce those missing documents because they did not exist. By late afternoon, an official notice had been prepared requesting an immediate review of every recent action affecting the property until the ownership questions were resolved under the recorded trust requirements. As we walked out of the courthouse carrying neatly organized binders of certified evidence, Margaret looked at me and smiled. "Tomorrow," she said, quietly, "the conversation at that front gate is going to sound very different from the last one." The next morning, the sunrise painted the fields the same warm gold my father had loved his entire life. But this time I drove toward the front gate, carrying something far more powerful than anger. Inside a leather binder rested certified surveys, recorded trust declarations, archived filings, dated photographs, contractor timelines, and every document my father had quietly prepared months before anyone believed they had outsmarted him. Margaret rode beside me, and behind us several county officials arrived in separate vehicles, including the licensed surveyor responsible for verifying the original property boundaries. The same black steel gate stood across the driveway. The same security guard stepped forward. The taller one recognized me immediately, but before he could speak, one of the county officials introduced himself and calmly requested access to conduct an official property review based on newly verified public records. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Linda appeared from the farmhouse porch with the same confident stride I had seen days earlier, but this time her smile faded when she noticed the survey tubes, the certified binders, and the county seal displayed on the documents. She insisted that everything had already been approved, yet every statement was met with another recorded filing, another notarized declaration, or another dated survey map placed carefully across the hood of a county vehicle. The licensed surveyor walked the original boundary markers one by one, comparing them against the official records filed by my father months before his passing. Bright orange construction stakes that had seemed permanent only days earlier now sat several feet inside protected agricultural acreage identified on the certified survey. Contractor permits were reviewed alongside trust requirements, and one question continued returning no matter who examined the paperwork. Where was the recorded deed transferring authority over the Walker farm? No one could produce it because it had never existed. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument ever could. The security guards quietly stepped aside after receiving updated instructions from the county officials. The electronic gate slowly opened, not because someone granted me permission, but because the public record finally matched the truth my father had spent his life protecting. I drove through at walking speed, passing the fresh landscaping, the decorative lanterns, and the polished fencing that had briefly tried to disguise generations of family history. None of it changed what the land had always been. I parked beside the old farmhouse and stepped onto the familiar porch. The wooden boards still creaked beneath my boots exactly as they had when I was a little boy racing inside after long afternoons working cattle with my father. The morning breeze carried the smell of fresh hay, cedar, and rich Texas soil, washing away the scent of fresh paint that had seemed so out of place only days before. Before leaving, I walked to the entrance and removed the temporary community sign that had stood where my grandfather's welcome marker once greeted visitors. Waiting in the bed of my truck was the weathered wooden sign my father had stored years earlier. Together, Hank and I secured it back onto its original posts. The carved letters were faded, but they were still strong enough to tell the only story that mattered. Walker Family Farm. As the windmill turned above the pasture and its familiar rhythm echoed across the fields, I realized my father had left me something far greater than land. He had left me patience, preparation, and the understanding that real justice does not arrive with loud celebrations or dramatic speeches. It arrives one verified document, one honest record, and one undeniable truth at a time, until even the strongest gate has no choice but to open.